Mail order bride was left at station with a baby. Then lonely rancher said, "Let me hold you both." The whistle fades. Dust rises on the empty platform. A young bride clutches her crying baby, staring down a promise that never came. The townsfolk laugh. The church bell tolls. She is abandoned, mocked, with nowhere to go. Then boots echo against the boards. A lone rancher steps forward, his face carved with grief, his voice steady as iron. "Let me hold you both." But shelter in his arms is only the beginning. Shadows of betrayal ride back into town. A gambler claims her as his debt. A railroad agent waves papers to steal the ranch. Whispers spread the child's blood may not even be clean. The wind howls across the prairie, the stakes rising higher than the mountains themselves. Now one broken man and one forsaken woman must fight for land, for dignity, for the chance to be a family again. Will the weight of secrets tear them apart? Or will faith and fire forge a home no power on earth can take away? This channel isn't just about stories. It's about remembering what still holds value, empathy, truth, and the courage to care. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Colorado rail station platform as Samantha Whitfield stood clutching her infant son Samuel to her chest. Her other hand gripped the worn carpet bag that held everything they owned in the world. The train's whistle screamed a farewell, and great clouds of steam billowed past her skirts as the locomotive pulled away, leaving mother and child alone. Samantha's heart pounded as she scanned the faces on the platform. She searched for the man who had promised to meet her here, the one whose letters had given her hope for a new life after becoming a widow. But as minutes ticked by, that hope began to crumble like dry prairie dirt. Samuel whimpered against her shoulder, his tiny fists bunching in the fabric of her travel-worn dress. The late summer heat pressed down, making the air thick and uncomfortable. Samantha bounced him gently, though her arms ached from the long journey. "Hush now, sweet boy," she whispered, but her voice trembled. The station agent bustled past, deliberately avoiding her gaze. Two ranch hands lounging against a post didn't bother to lower their voices as they snickered. "Another mail-order bride left high and dry," one said, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "Fool's errand," his companion agreed with a cruel laugh. "Ain't the first, won't be the last." Heat crept up Samantha's neck, but she held her head high, even as tears threatened. Samuel's cries grew louder, echoing her own desperate feelings. She knew he was hungry. The last of his milk had been given hours ago on the train. More townsfolk gathered, their whispers carrying across the platform like tumbleweeds. Some showed pity, others scorn, but none stepped forward to help. The shadows stretched longer, and with them, Samantha's fear grew. Night would fall soon, and she had nowhere to go, no money for a room, and no one to turn to in this strange town. Her knees began to weaken. The platform seemed to sway beneath her feet as the full weight of her situation pressed down upon her shoulders. Samuel's cries turned to hiccuping sobs that tore at her heart. She had risked everything on the promise in those letters, and now the crowd parted suddenly and a tall figure stepped forward. Dust coated his boots and trail clothes, speaking of long days in the saddle. His broad-brimmed hat cast shadows across his face, but Samantha could see the quiet strength in his features. This was Emmon Carter, though she didn't know his name yet. He moved with the careful grace of a man used to handling spooked horses, approaching slowly but purposefully. His eyes met hers, and in that moment, Samantha saw something that made her breath catch, recognition. Not of her face, which he'd never seen before, but of something deeper. He knew the look of loss, of desperate hope, of courage failing in the face of cruel reality. The whispers around them fell silent. Even Samuel's cries softened to whimpers as the stranger approached. Emmon stopped a respectful distance away, but close enough that his next words carried clearly across the platform for all to hear. "Let me hold you both," he said firmly, his voice low and steady as a mountain stream. The words weren't a question or a suggestion, but a declaration of protection. They cut through Samantha's fear like a knife through butter. She saw his arms extend slightly, not demanding, but offering shelter from the storm of whispers and judgment that swirled around them. For a long moment, Samantha stood frozen, searching his face. She saw no mockery there, no hidden agenda, only a solemn understanding, an offer of help that seemed to come from his very soul. Samuel hiccuped once more and reached out one tiny hand toward the stranger, as if sensing a safe harbor in this sea of uncertainty. The watching crowd held its collective breath. The late afternoon light painted everything in shades of gold and shadow, and in that moment, time seemed to stand still on the dusty platform. The decision that faced Samantha stretched out before her like the vast Colorado prairie, terrifying in its openness, but holding the promise of hope. Standing there with her baby in her arms and her world balanced on the edge of a stranger's kindness, Samantha felt the weight of every eye upon her. But it was only Emmen's steady gaze that mattered, those eyes that somehow knew exactly what it meant to be lost and found again. The townsfolk stood transfixed as Emmen Carter lifted Samuel from Samantha's arms with surprising gentleness. His weathered hands cradled the infant with the careful touch of someone who remembered how precious such a burden could be. He guided Samantha to his waiting wagon, steadying her elbow as she climbed onto the wooden seat. The wagon wheels creaked as they rolled down the rutted main street. Samantha sat rigidly beside him, her back straight as a fence post, hands folded tightly in her lap. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows from the false-fronted buildings, and curious faces peered from shop windows. They passed the white-clapboard church, its steeple reaching toward the darkening sky like a finger pointing to heaven. Samuel had settled against her chest, soothed by the wagon's gentle swaying. The buildings of town gave way to open range, where tall prairie grass rippled like waves in the cooling wind. Samantha stole glances at the stranger beside her, trying to read his intentions in the stern lines of his face. Emmen kept his eyes on the trail ahead, handling the reins with quiet confidence. The silence stretched between them until he finally spoke, his voice low and rough with disuse. "Lost my wife and boy 3 years ago." He didn't elaborate, but the weight of grief in those few words told volumes. Samantha swallowed hard before finding her own voice. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Then, feeling she owed him some explanation of her own situation, she continued, "Joseph Harland was his name. He wrote such promising letters. Said he had a place ready for us." Her voice caught slightly, "But he never came." Emmen nodded once, acknowledging her words without comment. The wagon rattled onward as dusk began to settle over the prairie. Samuel dozed in her arms, his warm weight both comfort and concern. The air grew sharper with evening's chill, and Samantha pulled her thin shawl tighter around them both. The first stars were appearing in the eastern sky when Emmen's ranch finally came into view. The house stood weathered and alone against the horizon, a thin spiral of smoke rising from its stone chimney. A barn leaned slightly to one side, and a corral stretched behind it. It wasn't much, but after the uncertainty of the station platform, it looked like shelter at least. Emmen brought the wagon to a stop near the house. He climbed down first, then reached up to help Samantha descend while she clutched Samuel close. His hands were strong and sure, but he released her quickly once her feet touched the ground. With practiced movements, he led them to the front door, stopping to stamp trail dust from his boots. Before entering, the house's interior wrapped around them with unexpected warmth from the banked fire. Samantha's eyes adjusted to the dim light, taking in the neat but sparse furnishings. A wooden table with 4 chairs dominated the main room. Rough shelves lined one wall, holding a few books and cooking implements. Everything was clean and orderly, but there was a stillness about the place that spoke of long emptiness. No curtains softened the windows, no quilts brightened the chairs. All the small touches that made a house feel truly lived in were absent. Emmen moved with quiet efficiency, lighting the lamp on the table and adding wood to the fire. The yellow lamplight cast soft shadows on the walls as he went about preparing this simple supper. Samantha stood uncertainly near the door until he pulled out a chair for her, gesturing for her to sit. Samuel stirred and fussed as savory smells filled the room. Emmon spooned beans into 3 chipped bowls and cut thick slices from a loaf of bread. He set one bowl before Samantha, then took his own seat across the table. The wooden chairs creaked. In the silence, they ate without speaking, the clink of spoons against bowls the only sound besides Samuel's occasional soft noises. The beans were plain but filling, the bread fresh enough to still be soft. Samantha found herself stealing glances at her host between bites, wondering at the twist of fate that had brought her to this quiet table instead of the one she'd imagined in Joseph Harlan's letters. The lamplight flickered across Emmon's features as he ate, casting shadows that made him seem both familiar and mysterious. His movements were careful, deliberate, like a man who had learned to live within careful boundaries. Yet there was nothing threatening in his silence, only a deep, steady patience that seemed to fill the room like the warmth from the fire. Samuel dozed against her shoulder, his small body growing heavier with sleep. The wooden table between them seemed both barrier and bridge, a space where 2 broken stories might somehow find a way to mend. Outside, darkness had fully claimed the prairie, and the wind whispered around the corners of the house, reminding them of the vast emptiness beyond these walls. After the quiet supper, Emmon rose from the table, his chair scraping softly against the wooden floor. "Need to tend to the horse," he said, his voice low. "Make yourself at home." He picked up his hat and stepped out into the darkness, leaving Samantha alone with Samuel in the lamplit kitchen. Samuel stirred against her shoulder, making those small sounds that told her he would need feeding soon. As she settled him more comfortably in her arms, her eyes wandered around the room, taking in the sparse but tidy space. The firelight caught something on the mantel, a leather-bound Bible, its gold lettering barely visible beneath a thin layer of dust. The pages looked well-worn though, speaking of frequent use in earlier days. She rose carefully, walking closer to examine it. The Bible's spine was creased in multiple places, and when she carefully opened it, she found passages marked with pressed leaves, now brown and brittle. This was no mere decoration, it had been someone's daily companion, though clearly not in recent times. The door creaked open as Emmon returned, bringing with him the sharp scent of night air. He stood awkwardly for a moment, then moved with purpose toward a storage chest in the corner. "I'll make up a cot for you," he said, pulling out blankets and a thin mattress. "Sorry it ain't much. House only has the one proper bed." Samantha watched as he arranged the cot near the hearth, his movements precise and careful. The firelight caught the silver threading through his dark hair as he worked. "You're very kind, Mr. Carter," she said softly. "I'm much obliged for the shelter." He paused in his task, not looking up. "Emmon," he corrected quietly. "Just Emmon is fine." He finished preparing the cot, then straightened. "There's water in the pitcher if you need it. I'll be right here at the table." Hours passed slowly. Samantha lay on the cot, Samuel nestled beside her, listening to the prairie wind's lonely song around the house corners. The fire crackled softly, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Though exhausted, sleep eluded her. Across the room, Emmon sat at the table, his broad shoulders bowed. The Bible now lay before him, but he made no move to open it, just stared at its dusty cover as if it held both comfort and accusation. His stillness spoke volumes, of grief held close, of discipline maintained. Even in the dim light, she could see how his hands sometimes clenched and unclenched on the table, as if holding back from reaching for something long gone. The night deepened. Samuel slept peacefully beside her, his tiny breath steady and reassuring. Samantha dozed fitfully, always aware of the stranger across the room, yet somehow not afraid. There was something in his careful distance that spoke of respect, even protection docked just before dawn. When the sky outside the windows had barely begun to lighten, Samuel started fussing. Samantha stirred, ready to attend him, but before she could rise, Emin was there. His movements were surprisingly quick and sure as he lifted the baby. "Let me," he said, voice rough with emotion. "Been a while, but I remember how." Samantha watched, breath caught in her throat as this weathered rancher cradled her son. Emin's large hands held Samuel with incredible gentleness, and he began to rock slowly, his boots making soft scraping sounds on the wooden floor. The gray light of approaching dawn filtered through the windows, painting everything in soft shadows. Samuel quieted almost immediately, tiny fingers curling around one of Emin's calloused digits. Something in the man's face changed, softened, as he looked down at the infant. "Haven't held a little one since my Matthew," Emin said, his voice barely above a whisper and trembling slightly. "He was just starting to walk when the fever took him, and Sarah both." He swallowed hard, still rocking. 3 years ago now. Samantha sat up slowly, drawing her shawl around her shoulders. In the pearl gray light of dawn, she could see clearly the tenderness in Emin's expression, the careful way he supported Samuel's head. This was a man who knew the precious weight of a child, who remembered the sacred trust of holding something so small and vulnerable. Though her natural wariness remained, she had learned the hard way about trusting too quickly. Something else stirred in her heart. A fragile thread of understanding, perhaps even trust, began to weave itself between them as she watched him with her son. This man's grief was real, his gentleness genuine. In the quiet of the early morning, with Samuel content in Emin's arms, she felt the first stirring of hope that perhaps they had found not just shelter, but something more. The first rays of sunlight streamed through the kitchen window as Samantha stirred cornbread batter in a clay bowl. Samuel lay contentedly in a makeshift bed of blankets near the hearth, cooing at dust motes dancing in the golden light. Emin had been up since before dawn, his morning chores marked only by the distant sounds of boots on wooden planks and the creak of a pump handle. The smell of fresh coffee drew him back inside. His weather-worn face showed surprise at the sight of cornbread baking in the cast-iron skillet. "Ain't had fresh-baked nothing in a good while," he said quietly, pouring 2 cups of the steaming brew. They shared this simple breakfast in companionable silence, broken only by Samuel's gentle baby sounds. When the last crumbs were gone, Emin stood, adjusting his hat. "Reckon you ought to see the place proper," he said. "If you're staying, you should know what you're getting into." Samantha fashioned a sling for Samuel from her shawl, securing him close against her chest. The morning air held a bite of chill as they stepped outside. From the porch, she could see the full scope of Emin's ranch spread out before her in the clear light. What must have once been proud and prosperous now showed clear signs of hardship. The split-rail fences sagged in places, weather-beaten and gray. Empty corrals stood silent, their gates hanging loose on leather hinges. In a distant pasture, a small herd of cattle grazed on sparse, sun-scorched grass. "Used to run 300 head," Emin said, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "Drought took most. What the dry spell didn't claim, the railroad did. Been fighting their land grab claims for 2 years now." He paused, squinting at the horizon, down to 40 head. Barely enough to keep going. Samantha watched his face, seeing the weight of failure he carried. "Would you welcome some help with the morning chores?" she asked softly. "I may not know much about ranching, but I'm willing to learn." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, perhaps gratitude. He nodded slowly. "Chickens need tending. Water's gotta be hauled. Noon meal wants preparing." Throughout the morning, Samantha fell into a rhythm of work, Samuel secure against her as she moved from task to task. She gathered still warm eggs from beneath clucking hens, their feathers soft against her fingers. The well pump protested at first, but soon yielded clear, cold water that splashed into her bucket. Near midday, Emin found her examining the chicken coop's damaged roof. Without a word, he brought tools and spare boards, showing her how to measure and nail the patches in place. His hands were steady as he demonstrated, and though he spoke little, his instruction was patient. The sun climbed higher, beating down on the parched land. A small group of riders appeared on the ridge, their horses kicking up dust as they approached. Samantha felt their curious stares as they drew closer to the ranch house. "Afternoon, Carter," called one man, touching his hat brim. The others nodded, their eyes moving from Emin to Samantha and the baby. They exchanged few words before moving on, but their whispered conversations carried back on the wind. Samantha's cheeks burned. She knew what they must be thinking. A strange woman with a baby suddenly appeared at the lonely rancher's home. Emin stepped closer, his voice low and gentle. "They don't know you yet," he said. "Give it time." As afternoon shadows lengthened, Samantha took stock of the meager pantry. She found dried beans, some wrinkled potatoes, and a few preserved vegetables. It wasn't much, but her mother had taught her to make something from nothing. Soon, a pot of stew simmered on the stove, filling the kitchen with savory warmth. The lamplight cast a soft glow as they sat down to supper. Samuel dozed in his blanket nest, one tiny fist curled near his chin. Steam rose from their bowls, and Emin's first taste brought a look of surprise to his face. "Been a long spell since this kitchen saw real cooking," he said quietly. Samantha looked around the room, seeing it with new eyes. Yes, the ranch was struggling, the house worn by time and solitude. But as lamplight filled the corners and the aroma of home-cooked food lingered in the air, the desolation seemed to retreat. Something else was taking root here, something that felt, despite all uncertainty, like the first fragile shoots of home. Morning sun warmed the barnyard as Emin worked at his leather repair bench outside the stable. His weathered hands moved steadily over worn bridles and reins, the familiar motions bringing comfort. The creak of leather and clink of metal bits filled the quiet air. Samuel's happy gurgles drifted from where Samantha hung laundry nearby, her soft humming mixing with meadowlark song. The peace shattered at the sound of approaching hoofbeats. A rider appeared through the dust, his horse lathered and breathing hard. Samantha's humming stopped abruptly. The basket of wet clothes dropped from her hands. "Joseph," she whispered, clutching Samuel closer. Joseph Harlan sat tall in his saddle, but his clothes were trail-stained and his face carried the desperate look of a hunted man. His eyes darted between Samantha and Emin as he dismounted. "There you are, my dear," he called, voice dripping false charm. "I've been searching everywhere. Time to come along home now." Emin set down his work and rose slowly, positioning himself between Joseph and Samantha. "This is her home now," he said, voice quiet but firm as granite. Joseph's smile turned ugly. "That so? Well, seeing as I paid good money for her passage west, I reckon she belongs with me." He pulled a wrinkled paper from his vest. "Got the receipt. Right here for train fare from Missouri." "I don't belong to anyone," Samantha said, though her voice shook. Samuel began to fuss, sensing her distress. "Oh, but you do," Joseph sneered. "Made some promises on your behalf, I did. Got some fellows expecting payment, and you're it." He took a step forward, but Emin didn't budge. "She ain't going anywhere," Emin said. His hands stayed loose at his sides, but his stance was solid as an oak. Joseph's face darkened. "Careful now, Carter. Might want to consider what could happen to a woman alone with a baby of," he paused meaningfully, "questionable background. Lots of accidents can befall a little one out here on the frontier." Samantha gasped. Emin's voice dropped even lower, carrying the warning rumble of distant thunder. "Get off my land." "This ain't over," Joseph spat. He swung back into his saddle, yanking the reins hard. "I'll be back with papers proving my claim, you'll see." His horse whirled, kicking up dust as he galloped away, The moment he disappeared, Samantha's legs gave way. She sank to the ground, clutching Samuel as tears spilled down her cheeks. Emmon helped her up gently and guided her inside to the kitchen. "I was such a fool," she whispered, rocking Samuel as she wept. His letters seemed so sincere, so full of promise. He wrote of having a home ready, of wanting a family. Her voice broke. "I should have known better than to trust pretty words on paper." Emmon moved quietly around the kitchen, pouring her a cup of water and finding a clean cloth. He offered both without comment, his presence steady and sure. "Said he was a businessman," Samantha continued, dabbing her eyes. "That he had prospects out west. Never mentioned gambling debts or," she hugged Samuel tighter, "using me to pay them." "His words mean nothing here," Emmon said finally, settling into the chair across from her. "Neither do his threats." Samuel had quieted, one tiny hand curled around his mother's finger. Outside, the wind stirred aspens into silver-leafed whispers. Evening approached, painting the kitchen windows gold dot as darkness gathered. Samantha lit the lamp and knelt by Samuel's makeshift bed. Her voice carried, soft and clear in the stillness, "Dear Lord, grant me strength to face whatever comes. Protect my son from those who would harm him. Guide my steps on this uncertain path." She paused, drawing a shaky breath. "And thank you for sending good people when I most needed help. Amen." Emmon sat at the table, his Bible before him but unopened. His hands clenched and unclenched as he stared into the lamp's flame. Rage at Joseph's threats warred with the fear gripping his heart. Fear of caring too much, of losing again. He had built walls around his grief, but they were crumbling now, brought down by a baby's laugh and a woman's quiet courage. The lamp flickered, casting shifting shadows on the walls. Outside, a coyote called lonely across the darkening prairie. Inside, 3 souls waited in the gathering night, bound together by circumstance and something deeper neither Emmon nor Samantha dared yet name. The morning after, Joseph's visit dawned clear and cool. Life settled into gentle rhythms at the Carter Ranch, each day bringing small changes that softened the edges of their shared solitude. Samantha rose early, kindling the cook stove while Samuel dozed in his basket nearby. The kitchen gradually filled with warmth and the scent of coffee as she mixed biscuit dough with practiced hands. Through the window, she watched Emmon crossing the yard with 2 brimming water buckets, his steady stride matching the sun's climb over the eastern hills. By mid-morning, while Emmon tended the cattle, Samantha carried baskets of laundry to the creek. She settled Samuel on a blanket in the shade, entertaining him with songs as she worked. The sound of running water mixed with his happy gurgles, and sunshine sparkled on wet fabric as she wrung each piece carefully. Her mother's voice echoed. In memory, good washing needs 3 things: strong soap, clear water, and patience. Back at the house, she hung the clothes on the line, sheets billowing like sails in the prairie wind. The mending basket waited on the porch, Emmon's work shirts with torn sleeves and split seams telling tales of hard labor. As she stitched, Samuel practiced rolling over on his blanket, determined little grunts making her smile. The days flowing one into another brought surprising moments of grace. Samuel's face lit up whenever Emmon entered a room, tiny arms reaching up in complete trust. The gruff rancher would lift him carefully, his large hands gentle as he cradled the baby. Sometimes Samantha caught Emmon speaking softly to Samuel. During these moments, sharing secrets neither she nor the wind could catch. One crisp morning, Emmon led a calm bay mare from the barn. "Time you learned to ride," he said simply, adjusting the stirrups while Samantha watched with mix of excitement and trepidation. "I've never," she started, but Emmon just nodded. "She's steady as they come. Name's Maple, on account of her color." He helped Samantha mount, showing her how to grip the reins properly. "Just sit tall and breathe easy. Horse knows if you're nervous." They worked in the corral, Emmon leading Maple in circles while Samantha found her balance. His instructions came quiet and clear, heels down, eyes up. Move with her stride. When Samantha nearly slipped sideways during a turn, Emmon caught her arm, steadying her. The near fall startled a laugh from both of them, his deep chuckle harmonizing with her lighter tone. The sound hung in the morning air like music, and for a moment, their eyes met in shared surprise at this unexpected melody. That evening, Samantha roasted a chicken she had traded eggs for at the general store. The familiar domestic tasks brought comfort, stuffing herbs under the skin, basting with careful attention, peeling potatoes while the bird cooked. The kitchen filled with savory aromas that drew Emmon in from his evening chores earlier than usual. They gathered at the table, Samuel secure in the wooden high chair Emmon had brought down from the attic. Samantha bowed her head. Lord, we thank you for this food, for the roof above us, and for the kindness found in this house. Emmon's head dipped in acknowledgement, though he remained silent. The quiet that followed felt full rather than empty, like a held breath before song. Samuel broke the moment by clapping his hands together, baby joy bubbling over at the sight of food. Emmon glanced up, meeting Samantha's eyes across the table. Something shifted in his expression, softening around the mouth, a lightening in his gaze that spoke of winter ice beginning to thaw. After supper, while Samuel drowsed in his basket, they sat by the fire without speaking. Samantha darned socks while Emmon whittled a small wooden horse, his knife stroke sure and gentle. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, but their silence held no darkness. Instead, it wrapped around them like a familiar quilt, comfortable and warm. Through the window, stars pricked the velvet sky one by one. The fire settled lower, popping occasionally as if in quiet conversation with itself. Neither Samantha nor Emmon felt compelled to fill the evening with words. They had found something rarer, the peace of shared solitude, the knowledge that loneliness need not be faced alone. Samuel sighed in his sleep, one tiny fist curled against his cheek. The sound drew both their gazes, and in that moment of watching over the sleeping child, they were united in purpose if not yet in heart. The night settled soft around the ranch house, wrapping this makeshift family in its gentle embrace. Idea came to Samantha while hanging fresh curtains in the front room. What if we invited folks for Sunday supper? She suggested, smoothing the fabric with careful hands. Just a few neighbors, maybe Reverend Porter and his wife. Emmon looked up from his coffee, brow furrowed. Been a while since this house saw company. That's precisely why, Samantha said gently. The Lord didn't mean for folks to be islands. She bounced Samuel on her hip, his cheerful gurgle filling the quiet kitchen. After a long moment, Emmon nodded. Reckon you're right. His voice was gruff but held a note of yielding. Henry should come too. Does more than his share helping me with fencing. The week that followed hummed with preparation. Samantha swept every corner, polished the old pewter candlesticks, and arranged wildflowers in a blue pottery vase. The morning of the gathering, she rose before dawn to start the bread, kneading love and prayer into each loaf. Rich beef stew simmered on the stove, filling the house with savory warmth. As afternoon shadows lengthened, wagon wheels creaked in the yard. Reverend Porter helped his wife down from their buggy, her gray hair neat beneath a Sunday bonnet. The Abbotts and Hendersons, neighboring ranchers, arrived together, bringing apple pies and fresh churned butter. Henry rode in on his pinto pony, a string of fresh-caught trout wrapped in leaves as his offering. Welcome, welcome, Samantha called from the door, Samuel cooing in her arms. Emmon stood beside her, hat in hand, nodding to each guest. His posture was stiff, but his eyes held warmth, the front room filled with the murmur of conversation and rustle of Sunday best clothes. Mrs. Porter immediately took to Samuel, bouncing him on her knee while telling stories of raising her own children, now grown and gone east. Henry sat near the window, speaking quietly with Emmon about spring grass conditions and water rights. Shall we sing before supper? Reverend Porter suggested, and heads nodded in agreement. Mrs. Abbott settled at the old pump organ, its notes wavering but true. Amazing Grace rose from gathered voices, followed by, What a friend we have in Jesus. The hymns seemed to soften. Something in Emon's face as he watched Samantha sing. Samuel nestled against her shoulder. Around the table, fellowship bloomed like desert flowers after rain. Hands joined for grace, voices mingling in thanksgiving. Bread was passed, stew ladled, and stories shared. Henry spoke of his grandfather's wisdom about reading weather signs. Mrs. Henderson recalled her first frightening winter on the frontier. Laughter rippled when Mr. Abbott described his losing battle with a particularly clever raccoon in his corn patch. The lamplight cast a golden glow, making faces shine with warmth and welcome. Samuel was passed from lap to lap, collecting kisses and blessings. Even Emon's usual reserve melted as he found himself drawn into conversation about cattle breeds and range management. After the plates were cleared and pie served, Samantha felt moved to speak. Standing at her place, hands clasped still there. Trembling, she addressed the group. I want to thank you all for coming, she began, voice soft but steady. When I came west, I was seeking a second chance after losing my first husband. The letters promised a new life, but, she paused, gathering strength. Instead of the future I expected, God led me here. To this ranch, to good neighbors too. Her eyes flickered to Emon before dropping to Samuel in her arms. The room held perfectly still. Emon half rose from his chair, his hand moving toward hers, then hesitating and falling back. The moment stretched like taffy, sweet with possibility. Mrs. Porter broke the silence with a gentle amen, and conversation resumed, warmer than before. But something had shifted, like earth after spring thaw. As the evening drew to a close, guests gathered hats and shawls. The Porters promised to visit again soon. Henry spoke quietly with Emon about helping with the north fence come Monday. Mrs. Abbott hugged Samantha, whispering, You've brought light back to this place, dear. Emon and Samantha stood together in the doorway, watching wagons and riders disappear into the gathering dusk. Samuel slept peacefully in his basket nearby, tired from all the attention. The house behind them hummed with lingering warmth, plates stacked for washing. Crumbs on the tablecloth speaking of shared bread and fellowship. Standing there, Emon felt peace settle over him like a familiar blanket. The weight of loneliness that had pressed on him these past years seemed lighter somehow. He glanced at Samantha in the fading light, wondering at how naturally she fit here, as if she'd always been part of his home story. The last wagon disappeared over the rise, wheels creaking softly in the distance. Stars began to prick through the darkening sky, and a cool breeze carried the scent of sage across the prairie. Dawn painted the eastern sky in pale gold when hoofbeats echoed across the ranch yard. Emon was already outside, checking the chicken coop, while Samantha heated porridge in the kitchen. The sound of approaching riders made them both pause. 3 men rode up to the house, their horses' flanks dark with sweat. The one in front sat straight-backed on a sleek black gelding, his long coat matching the horse's color. His companions wore gun belts low on their hips, hands resting near the holsters. Mr. Carter, the black-coated man's voice cut through the morning air. I'm Callahan, representing the Western Pacific Railroad Company. He produced a leather document case from his saddlebag. Emon stepped forward, positioning himself between the riders and the house, where Samantha stood in the doorway with Samuel. State your business. Callahan dismounted, boots raising small clouds of dust. I have papers here showing this property lies within the proposed expansion route. He extracted several official-looking documents, holding them out. The railroads claiming right-of-way. This is my land, Emon said quietly. Been ranching here 15 years. Got grazing rights passed down proper. Old claims don't hold against progress, Mr. Carter. Callahan's smile never reached his eyes. But that's not all we're here about. He pulled another paper from his case. Seems you're harboring a woman of questionable character. Samantha gasped softly behind them. Samuel stirred in her arms, sensing her distress. What are you talking about? Emmon's voice had dropped dangerously low. Joseph Harlan signed this document, transferring his marriage bond. Callahan held up a paper covered in flowing script. Says the woman promised herself to him, took his money, then ran off. That makes her presence here problematic. That's a lie. Samantha stepped forward, face flushed. Joseph abandoned me at the station. I never promised him anything beyond what was in those letters. Callahan's gaze settled on Samuel. And the child? No proper documentation of birth or parentage, I assume? Quite irregular. His tone dripped with false concern. Such uncertainty about legitimacy could affect any claim to property rights. Emmons, hands clenched into fists at his sides. The two armed men shifted in their saddles, watching him closely. The morning air crackled with tension. You get off my land, Emmons said, each word measured and hard as stone. We'll be back in 2 weeks' time, Callahan replied smoothly, returning the papers to his case. Best start packing up. The railroad doesn't take kindly to squatters. He swung back into his saddle, especially those harboring questionable individuals. The three riders wheeled their horses around and galloped away, leaving dust and devastation in their wake. As soon as they disappeared from sight, Samantha's legs gave way. She sank to her knees in the doorway, clutching Samuel to her chest. As tears spilled down her cheeks, I'm so sorry, she whispered. I've brought nothing but trouble to your home. First Joseph, now this. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs. Emmon stood rooted in place, staring at the horizon where the riders had vanished. The morning sun cast long shadows across the yard, and memories of past losses pressed in on him like a physical weight. His wife's death, his son's fever, and now this new threat to everything he'd built. Samuel's whimpers broke through his dark thoughts. The baby reached out one tiny hand, seeking comfort. Emmon looked at Samantha kneeling in his doorway, at the child who had brought unexpected joy back to his home, and felt something inside him crack. Without a word, he walked past them into the house. The familiar room suddenly seemed foreign, haunted by echoes of happiness too brief. He sank into his chair by the fireplace, though the hearth stood cold and empty. As evening settled over the ranch, shadows deepened in the corners of the room. Emmon hadn't moved from his chair, lost in memories of all he'd already lost, and the new losses threatening to overwhelm him. The crackle of a match drew his attention briefly as Samantha lit the lamp on the kitchen table. She sat there, in the pool of lamplight, Samuel sleeping in his basket beside her. Her lips moved in silent prayer, hands clasped tightly before her. Tears had dried on her cheeks, but her spine was straight, refusing to be completely broken. The night pressed in around them, full of unspoken fears. Outside, a coyote called mournfully across the prairie, its cry unanswered in the darkness. Inside, only silence held between them, heavy with the weight of tomorrow's uncertainties. Days stretched like shadows across the Carter Ranch. Emmon rose before dawn and vanished into endless work, returning only when darkness forced him inside. His hands gripped tools until knuckles turned white, driving fence posts and stringing wire as if physical labor could dam. The flood of fears rising in his heart, the rough posts tore his palms. Blood stained the splintered wood, but he barely noticed. Out here among the sage and dust, he could almost forget the weight pressing down on his chest. Almost. Inside the house, Samantha moved through quiet rooms like a ghost. She tended to Samuel, cooked meals, and swept floors that no longer felt like home. When Emmon came in for supper, they ate without speaking. Only the clink of forks against plates and Samuel's soft babbling broke the heavy silence. One evening, as shadows lengthened across the plank floor, Samantha lifted Emmon's Bible from its place on the mantel. Dust had settled thick on the leather cover. She ran her fingers over the worn binding before carrying it to the table where Emin sat staring into his coffee cup. "Do you believe God abandons those he loves?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it filled the quiet kitchen. Emin's shoulders tensed. He kept his eyes fixed on the dark liquid before him, watching ripples form as his hand trembled slightly. "Some wounds don't heal," he said roughly, then pushed back his chair and walked outside. The night settled deep around the ranch house. A cool breeze rustled through the cottonwoods, carrying the lonely call of a whippoorwill. Samantha had just finished washing the supper dishes when Samuel began to fuss in his cradle. When she lifted him, heat radiated from his small body. His usually bright eyes were glassy, unfocused. Fear clutched at her throat as she felt his forehead. It burned against her palm. "Lord, please," she whispered, gathering him close. She paced the floor, singing softly, trying to soothe his whimpers. But Samuel's cries grew more distressed. His tiny face flushed with fever. Hours crept by. Samantha sat in the rocking chair beside Samuel's cradle, pressing cool cloths to his brow and praying without cease. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she watched him struggle for each breath. The sound of her muffled sobs finally drew Emin from his bedroom. He stood in the doorway, face shadowed, watching mother and child. Something cracked in his expression as Samuel let out another weak cry. Slowly, as if moving through deep water, Emin crossed the room. He knelt beside the cradle, his large, work-roughened hand reaching out to touch Samuel's tiny fingers. The baby's skin burned against his. Memories crashed over him. Another night, another fever, another small hand growing cold despite his desperate prayers. His throat closed around the grief he had carried alone for so long. But this time was different. This time he wasn't alone in the darkness. "Lord," he whispered, voice breaking. The word felt strange on his tongue after so many silent years. "Don't take him too." Samantha's hand found his shoulder, squeezing gently. Together, they kept vigil through the long night hours, watching, waiting, praying. Samuel tossed fitfully in his cradle while the moon traced its path across the sky. As first light began to pale the eastern horizon, Samuel's breathing finally eased. Samantha touched his forehead. The burning heat had faded. His eyes opened, clearer now, and focused on her face. Relief washed through her like a cool stream. She sagged against Emin's solid presence beside her, too exhausted to hold back tears. Without hesitation, he wrapped an arm around her shoulders, drawing her close. They sat together in the gray dawn light, watching Samuel drift into peaceful sleep. Samantha's head rested against Emin's shoulder, their shared fear slowly giving way to profound gratitude. Something had shifted during the long night vigil, as if a door long rusted shut had finally creaked open. Emin felt it stirring in his chest, unfamiliar yet remembered. The first tentative flutter of faith reawakening. Like spring thaw after endless winter, it brought both pain and promise. His grip tightened briefly on Samantha's shoulder as emotion threatened to overwhelm him. Samuel sighed softly in his cradle. One small hand curled trustingly around Emin's finger. Morning light spilled through the window, touching the Bible that still lay on the table where Samantha had placed it. Its presence no longer accused, but invited. Morning sunlight painted long shadows across the Carter ranch as Henry's horse picked its way through the sage toward the broken corral. The Ute Scout's keen eyes took in Emin's troubled expression as he approached, noting the tightness around his friend's mouth and the slump of his shoulders. "Brother, you look like a man carrying stones," Henry said, swinging down from his mount. His moccasins landed silently in the dust. Emin managed a weak smile, gripping Henry's offered hand. "Reckon I am, railroads claiming my land." They worked side by side, replacing rotted posts and mending rails. The steady rhythm of their labor filled the morning air, the thud of mallets, the creak of fresh-cut wood. Henry watched as Emin threw himself into the work with desperate energy, as if trying to hold his world together with fence posts and determination. Finally, Henry paused, leaning on a post. "When I worked with the survey crews years back, I saw maps." He waited until Emmon looked up. "Treaty maps. Your land, it was marked separate from railroad grants." Emmon's hands stilled on the rail he was securing. "What kind of maps?" "Army. Keeps copies at Fort Morgan. Official documents showing boundaries." Henry's dark eyes held steady. "Could guide you there." Hope flickered across Emmon's face, quickly replaced by uncertainty. His shoulders tensed as he turned back to his work. Going up against the railroad, he shook his head. "Might lose everything. Anyway, you will lose everything for certain if you do nothing," Henry said quietly. The sound of footsteps drew their attention. Samantha approached carrying Samuel, who reached toward Emmon with a happy gurgle. Her eyes were bright with purpose as she joined them at the corral. "Henry's right," she said firmly. "We must fight for what is just." She touched Emmon's arm gently. "The Lord doesn't ask us to surrender to evil." Emmon looked from her determined face to Samuel's innocent one, then to Henry's patient expression. The weight of decision pressed heavy on him, but underneath he felt a stirring of courage he had thought long dead. "How far to Fort Morgan?" he asked finally. "One day's hard ride through rough country." Henry gestured toward the distant hills. "We leave at dawn tomorrow. We can make it." That evening, Samantha moved quietly through the kitchen, packing supplies for their journey. She wrapped thick slices of fresh bread and strips of jerky in clean cloth, tucking them carefully into Emmon's saddlebags. Her hands were steady, but her heart fluttered with worry as she worked. Emmon watched from the doorway, struck by her quiet efficiency, her unwavering support. "Thank you," he said softly. The words felt inadequate for all she had brought to his empty home. She turned, meeting his gaze. "Just come back safe," she whispered. Dawn painted the sky in shades of pearl and rose as Henry and Emmon mounted up the next morning. Samantha stood in the yard with Samuel snug against her shoulder, her shawl drawn tight against the early chill. The baby waved his small hand as if in blessing. "We'll be praying for you both," she called as they rode out. The day stretched long. As they pushed their horses through increasingly rugged terrain, they followed game trails up into the hills where pine trees grew thick and the air turned sharp with altitude. Henry led with the sure instinct of one born to the land, choosing paths that seemed to materialize from bare rock. The sun was sinking toward the western peaks when they finally made camp in a sheltered hollow. They shared a simple meal of Samantha's bread and jerky, watching stars pierce the darkening sky one by one. The night wind whispered through the pines, carrying the lonely cry of a coyote. "My people know about loss," Henry said quietly, stirring the small fire. "Lands taken, promises broken, but we endure." He looked across the flames at Emmon. "The spirit grows stronger through struggle, like a tree that bends in the storm but does not break." Emmon stared into the fire, remembering other losses, his wife, his son, nearly his faith. "Sometimes the weight feels too heavy to bear. That is why we do not bear it alone." Henry's voice was gentle but firm. "Your woman speaks truth. The Creator does not ask us to surrender to evil. He asks us to stand together, to fight for what is right." The fire crackled softly as silence settled between them. Emmon thought of Samantha's steady presence, of Samuel's trusting smile, of Henry's unwavering friendship. Perhaps he had been wrong to think his heart was forever closed, his spirit forever broken. Above them, stars wheeled in their ancient dance, witnesses to countless human struggles and triumphs. Tomorrow they would reach the fort and seek the evidence they needed. But tonight, under this vast sky, Emmon felt something long dormant stirring to life within him, not just hope, but the courage to fight for it. The noonday sun beat down mercilessly as Emmon and Henry approached Fort Morgan's weathered gates. Dust coated their trail-worn clothes, and their horses' flanks were dark with sweat from the hard morning ride. The sentries eyed them warily, especially Henry, but the Ute scout's steady gaze and clear purpose won them passage. Inside the fort's wooden walls, they dismounted in a yard busy with soldiers drilling and supply wagons creaking past. The main office occupied a long, low building with a tin roof that reflected the harsh sunlight. Inside, cool shadows and the scratch of pen nibs greeted them. "State your business," the desk sergeant drawled, barely glancing up from his ledger. "Need to see land survey maps," Emmons said, his voice rough from trail dust. "Treaty documents from '68. The sergeant's eyes narrowed. "Those are restricted materials. You'll need officer approval." They waited on hard wooden benches while minutes crawled past like hours. Emmons' fingers drummed restlessly on his knee until Henry touched his arm, a silent reminder to stay calm. Finally, a young clerk with ink-stained fingers approached. "Lieutenant says I can help you," he said. Quietly, "Something about railroad disputes?" The clerk led them to a cramped records room where yellowed maps and documents filled wooden cabinets. As he searched through the files, Emmons held his breath, prayer rising unbidden in his throat. Henry stood silent but watchful near the door. "Here," the clerk said finally, carefully unrolling a large map onto a table. "Survey marks from the Treaty Commission. Shows original homestead boundaries and," his finger traced a line. "Yes, exclusions from railroad grants." Emmons leaned close, heart pounding as he recognized his land clearly marked outside the railroad's claim. But before he could speak, boots thundered in the hallway. Callahan burst in with two of his men, his black coat dusty from hard riding. "Making trouble, Carter?" he sneered. His hand held a fat envelope that he tapped meaningfully against his leg, while looking at the officer who had followed them in. "These documents aren't for public viewing," Callahan said smoothly. "Railway business, you understand." He stepped forward, envelope extended. The young officer hesitated, looking from the bribe to Henry, who had drawn himself up to his full height. "I witnessed those treaties being made," Henry said, his voice carrying quiet authority. "Saw the marks put on paper. You wear the Army's uniform. Will you honor its promises?" The office fell silent except for the gentle rustle of paper as the map trembled under Emmons' hands. The officer's face worked as he struggled with his conscience. Finally, he straightened. "Make a copy," he ordered the clerk. "Official seal." "You're making a mistake," Callahan hissed. But the officer turned his back. The clerk worked quickly, hands steady as he traced the crucial boundaries. When the official stamp thumped down, Emmons felt its echo in his chest like a second heartbeat. "This isn't over," Callahan snarled as Emmons carefully rolled the precious document. They wasted no time mounting up, but hoofbeats already pounded behind them as they cleared the fort's gates. Callahan's men gave chase, their horses' iron shoes, striking sparks from the rocky ground. "This way," Henry called, veering off the main trail into a maze of ravines and dry stream beds. He led them through passages so narrow their stirrups scraped rock, up steep slopes where loose shale clattered beneath their horses' hooves. The pursuit gradually faded behind them as Henry's knowledge of the land proved superior to their enemies' determination. By mid-afternoon, they were alone again, picking their way carefully down toward more familiar country. The sun was setting when they finally caught sight of the Carter Ranch, painting the humble buildings in gold. Emmons' throat tightened at the thin curl of smoke rising from the chimney, at the lamplight glowing in windows that had been dark for so long. Samantha must have heard their horses approaching. She hurried out into the yard with Samuel held close, her face anxious in the fading light. When she saw them both safe, tears spilled down her cheeks. Emmons dismounted stiffly, his body aching from the long ride. But as he pulled the precious document from his saddlebag, a weight lifted from his shoulders. For the first time in days, perhaps years, he felt his face break into a genuine smile as he looked at Samantha. "We're not finished yet," he whispered, hope rising in his voice like a prayer. Dawn painted the Colorado sky in gentle pinks and golds as Emmon hitched the wagon for their ride to town. His movements were deliberate, each motion carrying the weight of what was to come. Samantha emerged from the house wearing her best dress, Samuel bundled warmly in her arms against the morning chill. "Are you certain about this?" she asked softly, watching Emmon secure the final strap. He nodded, jaw set with quiet determination. "Some battles need witnesses," he said, helping her onto the wagon seat. Samuel cooed and reached for Emmon's vest. As he settled beside them, making the big man's expression soften for a moment, the wagon wheels creaked along the rutted road into town. Other families in their Sunday best passed them in wagons and on horseback, heads turning to stare. Whispers followed their progress down the dusty main street. Samantha held Samuel closer, drawing strength from his innocent warmth. The white, clapboard church stood pristine against the morning sky, its simple cross reaching toward heaven. Inside, worn wooden pews gleamed from years of faithful polishing. Oil lamps cast a warm glow across familiar faces as the congregation settled in for service. Reverend Matthews stood at his pulpit, Bible open before him. His kind eyes swept across his flock, lingering briefly on Emmon, Samantha, and little Samuel in their pew. The morning hymn rose sweet and clear, voices joining in praise that filled every corner of the humble building. As the final notes faded, Emmon rose slowly to his feet. His presence commanded attention, though his voice remained quiet and respectful. "Begging your pardon, Reverend," he said, "but I have something that needs speaking before God in this congregation." The preacher nodded gravely. "Speak your piece, Brother Carter." Emmon withdrew the carefully preserved document from his coat. The paper crackled in the hushed church as he unrolled it. "This here's treaty evidence," he declared, voice growing stronger. "Shows clear as day that my land, my family's land, was never meant for railroad taking." Before he could continue, the church door burst open with a bang. Callahan stormed in, two armed men flanking him. His face was dark with fury as he pointed an accusing finger. "That paper's worthless," he shouted. "A forgery meant to cheat progress. This man has no right." "That will do, Mr. Callahan." Reverend Matthews' calm voice cut through the commotion as he stepped down from his pulpit. He moved to stand beside Emmon, his presence a bulwark of moral authority. "This is God's house, and we will hear truth spoken here." Henry rose from his place near the back, his dignified bearing drawing all eyes. "I saw those treaties made," he stated firmly. "Watched the marks put to paper myself. The land Brother Carter claims was kept from railroad grants by sacred promise." Murmurs rippled through the congregation. Several of the town's most respected citizens nodded in agreement, having known Emmon's family for years. Others glared at Callahan, recognizing the railroad's greed for what it was. Callahan's face reddened as he felt the mood of the crowd turn against him. "You'll regret this defiance," he blustered, but his threats rang hollow in the sacred space. "Seems to me," drawled old Jake Peterson, standing up from his pew, "that any man trying to steal another's rightful property ought to be the one feeling regret." Agreement rumbled through the church. More people stood, faces stern with disapproval. Callahan backed toward the door, his men shifting uneasily beside him. "Get out," someone called. "We don't cotton to thieves in this town." Others took up the cry until Callahan fled, jeers following him into the street. The heavy doors swung shut behind him, and a collective sigh of relief swept through the building. Samantha's hand trembled as she reached for Emmon's. Her fingers found his, and for the first time, he gripped back firmly, his calloused palm warm against hers. Samuel babbled happily between them, completely unaware of the drama that had just unfolded. Reverend Matthews smiled gently at the congregation. "Let us lift our voices in praise," he suggested, "for justice done and community preserved." The opening notes of Amazing Grace swelled through the church. Emin remained standing, Samantha's hands still clasped in his, as their neighbors' voices rose in triumphant harmony. Sunlight streamed through the windows, touching each face with golden light, blessing this moment of victory and belonging. Through the hymn's familiar verses, Emin never loosened his grip on Samantha's hand. His thumb traced small circles on her palm, speaking volumes without words. Here, before God and their community, he had claimed not just his land but also his new family. The simple gesture said more clearly than any words that he would never let them go. A week after the church confrontation, golden sunset painted the ranch in warm hues. Emin and Samantha stood together on the weathered porch, Samuel contentedly nestled between them. The evening breeze carried the sweet scent of prairie grass, and somewhere in the distance, meadowlarks called their evening song. Emin cleared his throat, his hands fidgeting with something in his pocket. "Samantha," he began softly, "these past weeks you've brought life back to this empty house." He paused, drawing a slow breath. "When I lost my family, I thought my heart died too. But you and Samuel, you've awakened something I thought was gone forever." Samantha's eyes glistened as she watched him struggle with words that clearly meant everything to him. Samuel reached up, tiny fingers grasping at Emin's worn shirt. "I reckon what I'm trying to say is," Emin continued, voice rough with emotion, "would you do me the honor of being my wife? Both of you becoming my family proper and true?" Tears spilled down Samantha's cheeks as she nodded. "We already feel like we belong here," she whispered. "With you." The following days buzzed with preparation. Word spread quickly through the community, and neighbors arrived bearing gifts, warm quilts stitched with care, fresh-baked pies fragrant with autumn apples, and wildflowers gathered from the prairie. The women fussed over Samantha, Mrs. Matthews, offering her own daughter's wedding dress, carefully preserved in lavender dye on the chosen morning. The little church glowed with October sunlight. Townsfolk filled every pew, their Sunday best brightening the simple space. Henry stood proudly among the guests, his presence a bridge between two worlds, his smile genuine and warm. As the church door opened, every head turned. Samantha appeared. In the borrowed dress, its white cotton softened by age but still elegant. Samuel, dressed in a tiny new shirt sewn by the preacher's wife, nestled in his mother's arms as she walked slowly down the aisle. Her face shone with quiet joy, eyes fixed on Emin waiting at the altar. Reverend Matthew's words rang clear and true through the hushed church. "Love, like faith, can be lost and found again," he declared. "Today we witness such a miracle." Emin's voice trembled slightly as he spoke his vows. "I promise before God to cherish you both," he said, one hand holding Samantha's, the other gentle on Samuel's head. "To protect and provide, to love and honor until my dying day." The final hymn rose sweet and strong, voices joining in celebration. After the ceremony, handshakes and hugs flowed freely, the community embracing its newest family. That evening, lantern light spilled warm from the ranch house windows. The kitchen filled with the rich aroma of beef stew, and laughter echoed from every corner. Neighbors lingered over coffee and pie, sharing stories and blessings. Samuel passed from loving arms to loving arms, each person adding their own prayer for his future. The house that had stood so long in silence now rang with joy, its loneliness banished by the miracle of love restored. The last wagon rattled away into the darkness, leaving the ranch house wrapped in peaceful silence. Crickets chirped their evening song, and a gentle breeze whispered through the cottonwoods. Inside, the warmth of celebration still lingered in the air, mingling with the sweet scent of pine logs crackling in the hearth. Samantha gathered Samuel from Mrs. Matthews' arms before their final departure, cradling him close as she climbed the familiar stairs. The baby's eyes were heavy with sleep, tiny fingers curled against her shoulder. In the nursery corner, she hummed softly while changing him into a fresh nightgown. her wedding ring catching the dim light as she moved. Emmon stood at the fireplace. Below, adding another log to build the warmth. His movements were deliberate, practiced from years of solitary evenings, but tonight everything felt different. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls as he adjusted the screen, then settled into the old rocking chair that had stood empty for so long. Samantha descended the stairs, Samuel drowsy in her arms. Without a word, she transferred the baby to Emmon's waiting hands. The child stirred briefly, then nestled against his new father's chest, completely at peace. Samantha eased down beside them, her head finding its place on Emmon's shoulder as naturally as if she'd done it 1,000 times before. "I'm finally home," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The words seemed to fill every corner of the room, erasing years of emptiness. Emmon's throat tightened as he pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. His heart felt too full for words. Reaching out, he drew the family Bible from its place on the side table, its leather worn smooth by generations of hands. With infinite tenderness, he guided Samuel's tiny palm to rest upon its cover. His voice, when it came, was rough with feeling. "Lord," he prayed, the words falling like warm rain after drought, "thank you for this gift of family restored. Grant U.S. strength for each day's trial, love to bind us close, and peace to fill this home." Outside, the prairie wind sighed against the walls, a familiar sound that had once echoed his loneliness. But now, as Emmon held his wife and son close in the lamp's golden glow, he knew that emptiness would never haunt him again. The ache that had lived so long in his heart had been replaced by something greater, a joy so deep it brought tears to his eyes. Here, in this moment, faith and love had made them hold on. If today's story echoed in your heart, I hope you'll stick around. Subscribe, and I'll be here again tomorrow with another story that speaks softly but stays deeply.